there are some real losers here that I don't think there's enough talk about right now. Everyone wants to discuss what is happening with Florida State and Clemson, but what about the big picture precedent this sets? Like, this is bigger than FSU and Clemson in the ACC. This actually starts to turn into something that we're going to see all across the board in college football. So this means that even teams in the Big Ten and the SEC, right, feeling untouchable, feeling invincible a lot of times these days, the same schools that will be chirping at you about SEC, and championing the accomplishments of Alabama, LSU, Georgia, those same schools are in some trouble now. So, man, because it is very obvious. Let's look at what's happening right now in the sport. Like, the Big Ten already has all these advantages. They have the richest TV contract in the sport, even slightly better than the SEC. Those guys are making so much money. And yet, what story just came out in January? It was that the Big Ten is accepting bids, looking into bids for private equity. Like, they're still looking around like, hey, that was a pretty good idea, Big 12. We may need a cash infusion here, even though we have all the money, all the advantages. Okay, so they're going to make cutthroat moves, you would have to imagine, when it comes to finances right now. Nobody is like in the mode of like, hey, maybe we should put this in the piggy bank and save things. Like, no, and we need more, and it's all greed driven. That's what's happening all across the sport right now. Okay, so with that in mind, how do you think the Big Ten, thinking it needs private equity, is looking at this right now? How do you think this is sitting in Columbus, Ohio? How do you think this is sitting in Ann Arbor, Michigan? They can look at the TV ratings. Like, you'll put Ohio State against Northern Illinois on Big Noon Kickoff before you will put a couple of mid-tier Big Ten teams playing, you know, before you would put even like Iowa, Wisconsin on Big Noon Kickoff. You would put Ohio State and Toledo, because you know how many eyeballs are going to be on the Buckeyes. They know how much more that they could make if you're going to start tilting all that revenue. Think of how big that revenue pot is too in the Big Ten, man. It's a lot of extra money that you could be making if you started doing it based on ratings. Tony Petitti's ears have got to be burning with leadership in some of the bigger brands, you know, out at Autzen Stadium, right? How's Oregon thinking about this too? The bigger brands. Didn't USC at one point try to push this through in the Pac-12 back in the Larry Scott era? They wanted some sort of unequal revenue sharing program here. I'm sure they're going to be back on top of that, even though their football program materially is not that great right now. I'm sure they are thinking the same thing. And then in the SEC, you know, I mean, they're not exactly known as just being folks who are out for, you know, utilitarianism. Like, let's just, you know, rising tide lifts all boats. Let's make sure everybody's good in the sport. No, very much greed driven, very much out for themselves. I'm sure Alabama and Georgia are looking around like, why are we paying Vandy the same amount that we are? The same way that Ohio State is looking like, why are we giving $70 million to Northwestern? Why not give them 35 or 40 and we'll divvy up the rest, right? This seems like a smart thing that you guys are doing, ACC. It's the way that this sport is moving, man. And it's crappy. And I don't like that this is where things are at, because it's this like hyper capitalism that is just taken over the sport. And it's going to wind up making it so much worse, and already has. But it is the reality. Greed is here. It's not going away. And if you think it's not permeating the Big Ten and the SEC right now with the wandering eye looking over at this plan, I think you are very, very, very naive. Very naive. And, you know, the conversation has been had a lot before. Like, well, people asked, you know, especially in the real heat, when we were in the throes of all of this realignment stuff, you know, maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when it was really popping and hot, when we had back-to-back summers of SEC stealing teams, Big Ten stealing teams, and then the Big 12, Pac-12 thing. Everyone was asking, like, all right, well, how long are the SEC and Big Ten going to just keep these other schools around? Will they just cut them out? You know, would they completely cut them out of the conference to trim the fat and up their money that way? And, well, they are very greedy, and it is hyper capitalistic, as I mentioned. that did seem to be like probably a bridge too far, at least at this point, for some of those schools. That can get messy. Like some of these schools have been with you from the jump, man. They're ride or dies. They've been with you for a long time. So the idea of cutting them completely out now seems crazy. Now, the Pac-12, push came to shove. They got painted into a corner, and you saw where the loyalty was when it came to Oregon State and Washington State. But we're not quite, we're obviously not at that like sort of desperate state for these leagues. So they don't want to deal with the mess of that. Well, this is like a perfect way to basically do that, but not deal with the mess of it. It's kind of their own version of a Florida State Clemson-esque compromise. They wouldn't get all $70 million of Northwestern's share back, but you could get half of it. Maybe you get half of it. Pay them 35, you divvy up the rest to those of us that are driving the eyeballs, right? And you can avoid dealing with the mess, still get richer and take that money. And when I talk about losers here, I just said Florida State and Clemson are winners, right? Florida State and Clemson, there are obvious ways that they are winners in this settlement. But if this idea is just going to be stolen by the Big Ten and the SEC, then really Florida State loses the ground that they just made up on some of these top tier teams in the Big Ten and the SEC. They're getting, as we just discussed, some of the math on that. If you're going to get an extra $20 million a year, you can more than have the difference between you and the SEC. But then if Ohio State is just going to steal, $20 million more from Northwestern and Indiana because of success and brand initiatives, well, then you're not actually gaining any ground on them. Now, I think what really matters to Florida State and Clemson is, can we gain ground on South Carolina and Florida? And maybe that still happens based on the current state of those programs. Although, last year, South Carolina, succession initiative wise, they might have done okay. But it gets very complicated. They do also, they want to truly compete at the top of the sport. And it comes back to the same issue with the Big 12 and private equity. When it's that seems like almost a necessary evil for the Big 12 at this point, but there's nothing stopping the Big 10 and the SEC from just doing the same thing and taking the exact same plan that the Big 12 had laid out there. And it looks like the Big 10 is already in progress in doing that. You take the exact same plan and you flip it to your own benefit. And now there's really nothing that's been gained. And the sport has become worse for it. So again, I go back to overall big picture, like we kind of all just lose. We kind of all lose. Anyway, that's some of the crappy part of where we're at in the sport. That is, I think, a harsh reality about what is happening here. And it's something that everybody needs to watch out for. Like the overall message here is just like nobody can really be safe unless you are in Columbus, Ohio, or Baton Rouge, Louisiana, or Tuscaloosa, Alabama, Athens, Georgia. Like you get the idea. If you're one of the top 10 to 15 brands in the sport, you're probably good. If you are anybody else, you need to keep your head on a swivel. You need to keep your head on a swivel. You may still have the SEC patch and the SEC logo, which is definitely better than not. It's better than not being in there. But in terms of your finances and how much everybody has now at this point really internalized and loves being able to turn around and gloat over the fact little Big 12, a cute little Big 12 over there. I see it a lot with Missouri, Nebraska fans, that sort of attitude, like, oh, look at you guys over there. Well, wait a couple of years. You guys may have success and brand initiatives in place in the SEC. You're going to start getting squeezed on your pocketbook, and all of a sudden there won't be this massive competitive financial advantage that you have over schools in the Big 12 because of where this all appears to be headed. And none of this is good, man. None of this is good. It's not good for anybody.